designing game-based moral courage. This is the topic of this talk. My name is Wolfgang. I am a lecturer at the University of Applied Sciences of Austria, the FH Oberösterreich. And as I said, designing game-based moral courage is what I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes or so. Getting back to this image, you might have seen but not heard what I said. You have maybe been in a situation like this. You see a woman being obviously harassed, followed by two men. Situation can also pan out differently. Someone getting harassed, physically attacked, mobbed, yelled at, bullied. We've heard that in the excellent keynote by Simone Kriegelstein today. So you've maybe encountered a situation like this. And maybe you've also wondered, what are the strategies that I can apply to intervene in such a situation? What can I do to solve a situation, to help the person that is affected in such a situation? And if you have asked yourself this question, or even if not, then welcome to the concept of moral courage. In German, we call it Zivilcourage. In English, it's moral courage. And I'd like you to start with a short definition first, because that's always we researchers like to do. It is a definition by Oswald et al. From 2010, and it basically sums up what moral courage is about. It is a pro-social behavior with high social costs and no or rare direct rewards for the actor. So the actor would be you as a person who comes to such a situation like we've seen in the previous slide. And in situations which demand a moral courageous intervention, instances of injustice happen, human rights are violated, persons are treated unfairly, and disregarding, or nature and cultural assets are in danger. So you can see that there is a broad variety of things that counts as a moral courage situation. But I think looking at this image before, you all know what I mean. By the way, the term is actually, it comes back from the beginning of the 20th century, and it's actually dated back to Otto von Bismarck, who brought it up as a counter term to soldier's courage. So you're not a soldier, you're in your everyday life, and you encounter a situation that requires intervention. It's very interesting. But let's head to the games domain, because that's what we're all here for, right? And obviously, when you think about how can we use games to make things like that better, you might think about games with a purpose, or serious games. I prefer this term a bit more. And I think I don't have to explain what this kind of games are, that they're not just for entertainment, but they serve a purpose in this case, to educate people about how to act for moral courage, what kind of actions they can take. And this is actually what I've been dealing with in the last 2.5 years in a project called Katrina, with the long title called the Courage Activation Research and Influencing Factors for Taking Action. So this was a research project we did. I'm from the University of Applied Sciences of Austria, and we did it with the partners from the Austrian Institute of Technology and the ZIMT. We also had 2 game partners, namely City Games in Vienna and Rudy Games from Linz. And we also worked together with an NGO, with SOS Menschenrechte, who consulted us on the issue of moral courage. And this was especially rewarding for us because they are organizing and conducting workshops with schools where they teach them exactly what we want to teach them with games, but just in very traditional manners, with workshops, hands-on role-playing and stuff like that. And so they have been advising us on this topic, which was really interesting because we had the chance to do some workshops with them and experience firsthand how moral courage intervention works. And this was really a nice thing to do. But what did we do in the project? We created 3 game prototypes to basically have people play through moral courage situations. We developed a hybrid card game, meaning a card game combined with an app. We developed the VR experience, which was done by us, the University of Applied Sciences of Austria, and this is mainly the application I will be talking about. And we also developed an urban game by City Games Vienna. So we had 3 totally different approaches in terms of abstraction and complexity and detail. It was really interesting to see those 3 things evolve, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. The next phase, and this is actually what the talk is about, is how to create the game concepts for such a thing. How do you teach people, on the one hand, how to behave in a moral courage situation, and how does the situation look like? So there's a few things that you need to do. First, you need to decide on what are people going to do in the game? What are things that actually work? How can you resolve moral courage situations? And this is why we actually had a look at so-called factors of moral courage. So what are the things that work out? And this is a research that had been carried out by our partner AIT before. And I've just summarized this here very, very briefly. This is not the complete table. I just did an abridged version that fits on a slide and contains the most important points. There's a publication where you can find the rest of it. This is a meta-analysis of factors gathered from a large number of papers that actually tells you which things do play a significant role in a moral courage situation. You have the effect sizes here are the higher or the closer to 1 or -1, the better, to be very brief about this. And there are some factors that work really well. The ones that are bold and red, those are the ones we used for our game. So you can see things like, I have to turn around because it's so small here, things like social responsibility, attention and emergency awareness, intervention skills, empathy. So we filtered out those that would actually work in a game concept, things that you can represent in a game design and things that you can make playable, so to speak. If you're wondering why gameplay is not one of the factors, it has a little bit of a different connotation in this context. So it's not actual gameplay having games, but it's more like things, how situations pan out. So we looked at the factors so that we knew what's going to work. And this is the first lesson we learned here. Because if you look at the factors we've chosen here, those weren't necessarily things that we had considered before. Like everyone has their idea how to solve a moral courage situation and what kind of actions or directions can work. And it turns out those are usually not the ones that research gives you. So it's really good. It's a bit of a no-brainer, yeah, but don't work on assumptions. Have your data to back you up and don't work with the things that your mind tells you. Just stick to the facts. Putting those things in game design decisions, yeah, that's the next step. How to create scenarios for games, narratives if you want, or a story that actually works and that is playable and that gives people exactly what you want, namely the options to solve a moral courage situation. If you look at different scenarios, you always have basically the same structure here. You have on the one hand, an affected person. That's the person that is usually suffering from something, the person that's being harassed, that's being, I don't know, mobbed, that's being bullied or something. And you have a perpetrator. So that is the person who is committing the offense. And there is always an imbalance of power. So the perpetrator is the one that basically tries to use this imbalance of power to force their will upon another person in what way ever. And what we did, or what we wanted, you're the third circle here. You're the player, the person who comes into such a situation. And your job in this case is to break this imbalance of power and to resolve it in what matter, or at least to see what can you do to make this imbalance of power better. So we thought about a number of possible scenarios. Yeah, and I've listed a few here. It's like racism against people of color. There is domestic violence that you could use. There's sexual harassment, aggression towards homeless people, or mobbing, bullying, and all those things. But there are a few things to consider when selecting a scenario. And this is something that SOS Menschenrechte, our NGO, made us clear. It has to be applicable to a broad variety of people. It doesn't help if your scenario is, let's say, racism against a person of color, and you're showing this to kids from rural Upper Austria, where persons of color are probably not really well represented. Yeah? They might not really connect to this scenario because it's not something they will see on a daily basis. The potential for violence is something that should never be your first or only solution. If hitting the perpetrator is what comes to mind first, then it will probably ruin your whole game, because that's what everyone's going to try, and you don't want that. Same thing, if the whole scenario is basically a case for a criminal prosecution, you also don't want that, because if calling the police is your only option, which is by all means a good thing to resolve such a situation, but if it's the only one or the first situation, because someone is standing there with a knife, then you have no other options. You just call the police and your game is basically over. So you don't want that as well. We've heard that from Simone this morning. Stereotypes are something that you want to avoid, because if you have too many of them, it might just become ridiculous. People will laugh at your scenario because it's so full of stereotypes, and then you also ruin your application or your game. And gender is always a thing. How do you distribute gender? Does the aggressor always have to be male, or can it be a woman? It still has to be believable. But you still have to figure out how to represent everyone equally. So what we did in our games is, our scenario basically was a woman selling newspapers in front of a supermarket, and she's being harassed by a man who wants to get a shopping cart and is obviously offended by her standing there, and she should get out of the way. He starts yelling at her, and you're going shopping and you're encountering this situation. So this is what we chose, and it took us quite some time to get there. And the reasons behind it is a very common scenario. So you see it in major cities as well as on the countryside. You have these people selling newspapers in front of many supermarkets. So everyone's probably seen those, at least in Austria. It was a national project, but I think it's not something too uncommon. Aggression towards newspaper sellers, it's not unusual. It happens if you ask yourself this. We've actually talked to actual persons selling newspapers in Linz, and they told us that it is actually a fairly common thing in different kinds of severities. The risk for violent behavior in this situation is very low. So there's not going to a fight is not going to break out anytime soon, probably, because it's not loaded with violence, but there's a lot of aggression involved. So this is kind of a good balance for such a thing. And also calling the police is not immediately necessary. You can always do that, but it's probably better to call the store manager or something than to go to the police directly. So that's a good basis for a more clear scenario. So take your time to choose your scenario, yeah, as always. So make sure that your target group is familiar with it, so you can work with it and it has the desired effects. So let's look at how we did it. As I said, three game prototypes. I'm going to show you two of those. The first one was the hybrid card game. It was meant as the so-called low-level approach, because the idea is to show these games in schools. And the card game, we've already heard that from Simone in the keynote today, is always a good thing because it's easily playable in school. And you can basically see what is happening here. So there is a hybrid card game. The mobile phone acts as the storytelling device. It tells you the moral courage situation. It tells you the situation you're in, and you need to react by playing the right cards. We can look at this in the next slide here. Hang on a second. Let's skip this. Yes, I can. The cards are in German, but I'm just mentioning briefly what they do. So you have this meter on top of the application where it says number 30. That's basically your progress. If it goes to 99, you've won. If it falls down to 0, you've lost. Yeah. And the hearts are your courage points. So you need a certain number of available courage points to play a card. And you see, like, if you play a card like the ones above, the red ones where it says do nothing, it doesn't cost you any courage point. And if you want something like beobachten or film the situation, observe it, then it's just 1 courage point. And if you would interact, it would cost you even more. So you have to balance that out. And the idea is you have combo effects and so on and so forth. So groups can devise their strategies and solve this situation together. If you compare it with the VR application we did, yeah, that's a totally different pair of shoes. You have a high detail, high immersion, single player scenario in this case, and you have a lot to consider. So it's like, who am I in the game? Who is the person that's playing? How does the affected person look like? How does the perpetrator look and behave like? How do I interact with the world as a player? How do dialogues work? What happens if I do nothing, for example? Or how big does my freedom of choice in the game have to be so that it works? So there's a lot you need to think about compared to what a simple, so to speak, simple card game does. And what we did is we decided to make our non-player character non-visible. So the only thing you see is hands. You have a mobile phone, for example. So you can do things like film the situation. So you have an incident report for later on. And basically the whole scene starts at the parking lot, and you go towards the supermarket. And then you hear this scenario, and you hear the people arguing. And then, as you saw in the video, you have different options. You can either stand there, film, do nothing. You can engage. You can get closer and listen. And then, as the game progresses, you have different choices. You can either talk to the perpetrator. You can either talk to the woman. And basically, you have branching narratives that resolve the matter in different ways. And it's meant to be played multiple times so that you can just check out your options and see what situation or what options lead to which situations. And in the end, you always get like a retrospect that tells you what has happened without judging. It just says, okay, I did this and that, so this and that happened. And then it's meant to be discussed in class, for example. What's interesting here is, and this brings me towards the end of my talk already, but this is the last important point. The crucial question is, how do you define the freedom of action or the so-called agency? You know, agency, the concept is what can you do in a game, and how much does the game basically let you choose your actions and tells you what your actions are going to do. And there is a paradox happening here, because on the one hand, you want, of course, your players to have as much agency, if you want to call it freedom to act, as possible, because that's what people are used to in VR applications. They can do everything they want, basically. Yeah, so they can look at everything, touch it, everything, throw mugs through the air and stuff like that. Whole thing really, really complicated. So you get a lot of branching narratives, a lot of branches here. And too many options can simply distract your players from your goal. If it gets too complicated, too many micro options, they will lose track of what you were trying to tell them. And of course, all options also need to be meaningful. It doesn't help if you have any options that are just placeholders or scenarios like, I don't know, stand there and talk to your neighbor or something, if that doesn't help what you're trying to achieve. And the most important thing is that might really sound weird a bit. The options must not give away their outcome. And this is what we call the paradox of agency, because while the agency is actually crucial for the players because they need and want to make choices that affect the game situations, they also must not be able to determine beforehand what their choices are going to do. Because if you give away the outcome of a possible action, then this whole inherent uncertainty that's always there in a moral courage situation, it will basically be destroyed. And then your whole intention of letting people experience what's happening is gone. So this is a kind of a weird thing. And this is the final lesson or the final takeaway, that the agency and the control of what happens next, it works a bit different for moral courage situations, because you shouldn't tell your players too much, even though in like a classical RPG game, you will want to do that because that people can make meaningful choices. And here you don't do this. So how do you solve it? We provided actions instead of written out sentences, because certain phrasing can give away meaning and you don't want that. Phrasing can also patronize your players and tell them, okay, if you do this and that, and this will happen, this will also destroy your agency. So keeping it uncertain is usually a good idea. Just final thing, just a final remark. We also did some user tests. I'm going to sum this up really quickly. What we learned is that our games really had the potential to stimulate a process for reflection. People reported, especially those who had really few experiences with moral courage situations, they reported that they felt like that their repertoire of action had increased. And so we're actually happy that this worked. They also rated the usability quite well, which is nice to hear. And those are actually my famous last words. I don't really have any. Thanks for joining me on this talk. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much.